I noticed the file contains a list of names already used in previous videos. Let me check it carefully before writing. The names to avoid are all listed in that file. I'll create entirely new names not found there. The morning of Thanksgiving, I burned the pie. Not badly, just the edges. Just enough that the whole house smelled like scorched sugar and cinnamon, which honestly should have felt like the holidays, but instead felt like a warning I was too busy to read. I'd been up since 5. I'd set the table with the good china, the set my wife Vera had picked out 31 years ago at a small shop in Savannah. I don't even like that china. The plates are too thin, and the pattern, little blue wildflowers around the rim, always struck me as fussy, but Vera loved it. And Vera had been gone 4 years, and so I use it every Thanksgiving because it's the closest I can get to having her at the table. My son was coming, my daughter-in-law, my 2 grandchildren. I had been looking forward to it since September. I want to say that clearly because it matters later. I wasn't a man who dreaded his family. I wasn't some grumpy old widower who sat alone by choice and resented company. I genuinely loved those visits. I'd bought a new board game for the kids. I'd driven 40 minutes to a specialty butcher for heritage turkey because my daughter-in-law had mentioned once, 2 years ago, that she preferred heritage birds. I'd written it down in my phone. That's the kind of father-in-law I tried to be. I should back up. My name is Lou Decker. I'm 64 years old. I worked for 31 years as a structural engineer, retired at 62, and now I spend most of my time woodworking in the garage and tending a garden that produces more zucchini than any one man should ever have to deal with. My son. I'll call him my son throughout this, because that's what he is to me regardless of everything that happened, is 33. He married his wife 8 years ago. She came from money, or at least from the kind of family where money was never discussed because it was simply assumed to be there. My son is a good man at his core. I believe that. I have to believe that. Otherwise, none of this makes sense. But he has a weakness. And that weakness is that he cannot say no to his wife. Not about anything that matters. After Vera died, I helped them buy their house. I want to explain why, because that question, why would any parent pay for an adult child's house, is one I've asked myself 100 times since. The answer is not complicated. My son had just been laid off. It was bad timing. It was not his fault. The company had restructured and his whole department was eliminated. His wife was pregnant with their second child. They were renting a 2-bedroom apartment that was fine for 1 child but was going to be genuinely cramped for 2. I had the money. Vera had a life insurance policy. And I'd been careful with our savings my whole life. And there it was, a lump sum sitting in an account earning next to nothing, while my son and his pregnant wife stressed about square footage. So I helped. $40,000 toward the down payment. No paperwork, because he was my son, and I was not going to make my son sign a contract with his own father. That was my mistake, and I see it now, but at the time, it felt like the only human thing to do. And that was just the beginning. The year after, they needed a new roof. The inspector had flagged it before closing, but they bought the house anyway. My daughter-in-law had fallen in love with the kitchen, and now the roof was failing, and the estimate was $11,000. I paid it. Then there was the furnace. $6,000. And my daughter-in-law decided she wanted to go back to school for her master's degree, which was a fine idea, a genuinely good idea. But the program cost $22,000, and they asked if I could loan them half. I did. I use that word, loan, because that's what they called it. I never called it that. I didn't expect it back. Maybe that was my mistake, too. In 5 years, I had given them somewhere north of $80,000. I'm not saying that to make myself look generous. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and because it matters for what happened on Thanksgiving. The grandchildren arrived first, which was typical. My daughter-in-law always sent them ahead while she finished getting ready, which could mean 10 minutes or 45 minutes depending on her mood. My older grandchild, 8 years old, came barreling through the front door without knocking, and immediately wanted to know if I had ginger ale. I did not have ginger ale. I had sparkling water. He looked at the sparkling water with the full contempt of an 8-year-old and said, "That's not the same, Grandpa Lou." He was right. It's not the same. The younger one, 5. Ran straight to the dog and threw both arms around him and didn't speak to me for a full 10 minutes, which is exactly correct behavior. My son came in after. He hugged me, a real hug, the kind where you actually hold on for a second, and said I looked good. And I told him he needed a haircut, and we stood in the kitchen and I handed him a beer, and for about 20 minutes, everything felt the way it was supposed to feel. My daughter-in-law came in last. She was dressed beautifully. She always is. That's not a criticism. It's just an observation. She has an eye for things, for clothes, for furniture, for other people's flaws. She kissed me on the cheek and said the house smelled wonderful, and then immediately asked if I'd remembered to get the gluten-free rolls, because her friend Petra was joining them, and Petra had a sensitivity. I had not known Petra was joining us. No one had mentioned Petra. "Oh, I'm sure I told you," my daughter-in-law said, without looking up from her phone. "It would have been in the group chat." "I am not in a group chat." I said that, politely. I said, "I don't think I'm in a group chat." She looked up then, and there was something in her expression. Not cruelty, not exactly, but a kind of mild impatience. The look you give a slow computer when it takes too long to load. "Lo," she said, "you really should learn to use your phone better." My son said nothing. I want to pause here and tell you what was happening inside me in that moment, because from the outside, I probably looked fine. I have 64 years of practice looking fine. I smiled. I said I'd see what I could do about the rolls. Inside, I was thinking about the furnace. I was thinking about the roof. I was thinking about $22,000 for a master's degree. I was thinking about the blue wildflower china set out on a table I'd wiped down that morning at 6:30 a.m. for people who were now critiquing my phone habits. Petra arrived at 3. She was perfectly nice. She brought wine and complimented the table and seemed genuinely unaware that she had been casually inserted into my Thanksgiving without anyone asking me. She ate 3 helpings of the turkey, so at least the heritage bird got its moment. We sat down. Grace. I still say grace. I always have. Farah and I said it together every Thanksgiving for 28 years. And then the meal. It was good food, if I say so myself. The pie edges were only slightly overdone. Halfway through dinner, my daughter-in-law made an announcement. She and my son had been talking, she said, and they decided to list the house. I looked at my son. He was looking at his plate. They'd found a new development, she explained. Newer construction, better school district, bigger lot. They'd already spoken with a real estate agent. They were planning to list in January, after the holidays. I said, "That's exciting news," and I meant it. It is good news, in theory, when your children want to move up in the world. Then I said, "What happens with the mortgage situation?" Because I had been helping with the mortgage, not every month, but when they'd asked, I had helped. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. The kind of thing that happened when you love your children and they're stretched thin and you're not. My daughter-in-law set down her fork. She said, and I am going to be exact here, because these words have been living in my head rent-free ever since. "Lou, we really appreciate everything you've done. But going forward, we need to handle things ourselves. We're adults. We need to build our own life without—" She paused, and she chose the next word very carefully. Interference. Interference. I had given them $80,000. I had driven 40 minutes for a turkey. I had set out the blue wildflower china. And the word she used was interference. Petra quietly reached for a wine bottle. My son said, "Dad, what she means is, I know what she means," I said. And I did know. I understood it perfectly. She was telling me at my own table, on a holiday I had cooked for since before sunrise, that my involvement in their lives was unwelcome. That money that had already left my account and entered their lives was being retroactively relabeled as a problem. That I was, in some fundamental way, too present. That the solution to my too presence was to be grateful and quiet and go away. I looked at my grandchildren. The 8-year-old was trying to balance a dinner roll on his nose. The 5-year-old had snuck down from her chair and was sitting on the floor with the dog again, feeding him something she'd quietly palmed from her plate. I finished my dinner. I thanked Petra for the wine. I said it was a lovely evening and that I was tired and that I hoped they'd enjoy the leftovers, and I began to clear the table. My daughter-in-law looked surprised. I think she'd expected tears, or argument, or the particular kind of wounded silence that needs to be managed and apologized to. I didn't give her any of those things. I gave her a dishcloth and asked if she'd mind helping with the drying. She did not help with the drying. They left around 8. My son hugged me again at the door, and I could feel the apology in it. Not words, but weight. He wanted to say something. He didn't. He followed his wife to the car, and I watched the taillights disappear down the street. And then I went inside and stood in my kitchen with the blue wildflower china drying on the rack and the leftover turkey wrapped in foil in the refrigerator. And I just stood there for a while. Then I sat down and did some math. I'm an engineer. I have always done math when I need to think. I got out a notepad. I still use paper notepads. I don't care what my daughter-in-law thinks about my phone habits. And I wrote down every dollar. The down payment, the roof, the furnace, the master's degree, the various mortgage assists, the smaller things, the emergency car repair, the plane tickets when my grandson had that health scare, the birthday deposits into the grandchildren's college funds that I'd continued out of habit and love, and the specific stubbornness of a grandfather. $83,400, plus interest if we're counting. I'm not counting. I sat with that number for a long time. I'm not a man who gives in order to receive. I want to be very honest about that, because this story could be read as a man who kept a ledger in secret and then got his revenge when the balance came due. That's not what happened. What happened is that I had spent 4 years since Vera died, quietly loving my family in the most concrete way I knew how. Writing checks, making the drive, buying the turkey, setting the table. And somewhere along the way, I had become interference. I slept on it. I slept on it for a week, actually. I went to the garage and worked on a side table I'd been building for the older grandchild's room. I tended the garden, which in November means mostly cutting things back and putting them to bed. I called my friend Norbert. We've been friends for 30 years. We work together. He knows me better than almost anyone. And I told him what had happened. Norbert, who is not a man of many words, said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Well, when you know, do it. Don't talk about it. Don't warn anyone. Just do it." That's why I've been friends with Norbert for 30 years. I called my financial advisor on a Monday morning. She had been my advisor since before Vera died. She knows my full picture. I told her I wanted to restructure my giving, everything that had been going to my son's household, the monthly contributions, the standing automatic transfers I'd set up for the grandchildren's college accounts under their parents' management. I wanted to redirect, not eliminate, redirect. The college accounts I moved to accounts solely in my name, with myself as custodian. That money was still for my grandchildren. It would always be for my grandchildren. But I would be the one deciding when and how it was used, not their parents. The monthly contributions to my son's household expenses. I stopped them. Just stopped them. No announcement, no letter, no speech. I simply did not transfer the money in December. My son called on the 15th. He said there was a discrepancy in their account. They'd been counting on a certain amount, and it hadn't come through. I said, "I know." There was a silence. He said, "Dad." I said, "You told me you wanted to handle things yourselves. I'm respecting that." Another silence. Longer this time. He said, "She didn't mean." "She said what she said," I told him. "And she said it clearly. I'm not angry. I'm not punishing you. I'm just taking her at her word." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was smaller and younger than the voice of my 33-year-old son, "We were counting on that money, Dad, for the new house, for the listing prep. And this is the part I want you to hear, because this is the part that matters." I didn't say with coldness. I didn't say with satisfaction, even though I would be lying if I said there was none. I said it the way you say something to your child when you love them, and you're still telling them the hard thing. Then maybe you shouldn't list the house right now. He hung up. He called back 20 minutes later and apologized. Not a full apology. Not the apology that addresses the real thing, the word interference, the dismissal at my own table, but a partial one. He said Thanksgiving had been stressful for his wife, that she'd been dealing with pressure at work, that it hadn't come out right. I said, "I understand. I also did not transfer the money. My daughter-in-law called 3 days after that. This conversation was different. She was controlled, articulate, precise. She is always those things. And she explained that she had meant no disrespect on Thanksgiving, that she valued our relationship, that she hoped I wasn't letting one moment color everything. I asked her if she remembered the word she used. She said she didn't know what I was referring to. I said, interference. You said my involvement in your lives was interference. She said she'd been talking about something specific, not everything in general. I said, I see. Then I said, I hope the listing goes well. I mean that sincerely. I think the new school district will be wonderful for the kids. She heard it. The implication, that she would be listing without my financial scaffolding underneath her. She heard it, and for the first time in that conversation, she didn't have an immediate response. She said she'd talk to my son. I said, please do. I want to tell you what December was like, because I think this part matters too. It was not triumphant. It was not satisfying the way I'd imagined it might be. Lying there the night after Thanksgiving, running the numbers on my notepad. It was quiet and a little sad and very clarifying. I spent Christmas Eve putting together a wooden train set for my younger grandchild. I'd built it myself over the past 3 months in the garage, piece by piece, painted each car, and I drove it over and left it on their porch, because I had not been invited for Christmas. That part was hard. I will not pretend it wasn't hard. I sat in the car for a while before I left the package. I could hear them inside. Voices, music, the particular chaos of small children who are deeply happy. I could see the Christmas tree lights through the front window. The 5-year-old had hung most of the ornaments at exact 5-year-old height. A dense cluster 3 feet off the ground, with a completely bare top half above it. I drove home and had dinner with Norbert and his wife, and it was a good dinner, and I was genuinely fine. But I want to say clearly, this kind of fine is not the same as easy. There's a version of the story where I tell you I had no regrets. The justice was served and I felt whole and righteous and at peace. That version would be a lie. What I felt was clear. For the first time in 4 years, I could see the shape of what had been happening. I could see how, slowly and by degrees, I had arranged my life around being useful to people who had stopped seeing the person behind the usefulness. I was a resource. I was a line item. And when a resource becomes interference, you cut it. Except that resources don't have feelings. I do. In January, they did not list the house. My son called me in mid-January to tell me this, as though I might not have noticed. He said they'd decided to wait. The market wasn't right. They wanted to pay down a little more before they moved. I said that sounded wise. He asked if he could bring the kids by on Saturday. I said, of course. They came Saturday. Just my son and the 2 grandchildren. My daughter-in-law was visiting her mother. We built a fire in the fireplace, and I taught the older one how to play chess. Sort of, badly, and the way you teach an 8-year-old chess, where the rules are approximately guidelines. The younger one fell asleep on the dog around 4 o'clock, and we let her stay there until dinner. My son and I didn't talk about any of it. We ate soup and cornbread at the kitchen table, and he told me about a project at work, and I told him about the side table I'd finished. And it was an ordinary evening, the kind that holds no drama and is therefore easy to forget but doesn't deserve to be. When they left, when I had buckled the younger one into her car seat and stood in the driveway in the January cold, watching the taillights go, I went back inside and stood in my kitchen again. Same spots on the counter, where Vera used to keep her pots. Same blue, wildflower china in the cabinet. Different man, maybe. I am still helping with the grandchildren's college funds. I will always do that. Because those children did nothing wrong, and they deserve every advantage I can give them. I manage it myself now. I send a letter to both grandchildren at the start of every new school year. Old-fashioned letters, on paper, with stamps, telling them what their fund looks like, telling them I'm proud of them, telling them that their grandmother would have been proud of them too. The 5-year-old cannot read yet. Her parents read the letter to her. I don't know how that conversation goes. I don't ask. My son calls every week now. His wife calls occasionally. The calls with her are brief and civilized and carry just beneath the surface a kind of care she's still deciding whether to show. I don't push it. I have stopped trying to be needed. I am trying, instead, to just be here. That turns out to be harder. It also turns out to be the only version of love that, at 64, I have any interest in practicing. Not love as investment. Not love as infrastructure. Love as presence, offered freely, not extracted or assumed or budgeted into someone else's financial plan. I burned the edges of a pie. I set the table at the good china. I bought a heritage turkey because someone mentioned it once and I wrote it down. Those things are still true. I am still that person. I'm just done apologizing for it. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to confuse love with leverage. Not in an abstract way. In the specific, personal way you think about something after you've lived it. After you've sat in a car outside your son's house on Christmas Eve, listening to your grandchildren laugh through a window you weren't invited through. That kind of thinking is different. It doesn't arrive in sentences. It arrives in the quiet between sentences. Here's what I've come to understand. When I handed my son that down payment, I wasn't trying to buy anything. When I paid for the roof, the furnace, the degree, I wasn't keeping score. I was doing what Vera and I had always believed you do when someone you love is struggling and you have the means to help. You help. That's not complicated. That's not a philosophy. That's just what decent people do. But somewhere in there, and I can't tell you exactly when, because it happens slowly, the way water gets into a foundation, the helping became expected. And when something becomes expected, it stops being received as a gift. It becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it develops a personality, when it has opinions and shows up at holidays and needs to be thanked and acknowledged. Infrastructure becomes inconvenient. That's what my daughter-in-law was telling me at my own table. Not cruelly. I thought about this a lot, and I don't think she's a cruel person. I think she's a person who had arranged her life around a certain set of assumptions, and I had become one of those assumptions. And assumptions don't get seats at the table. They just quietly keep the lights on. What she didn't understand, what I'm not sure she understands even now, is that every action carries a weight that eventually lands somewhere. Not as punishment. Not because the universe is keeping a ledger, simply because actions have consequences that are real and proportional and don't disappear just because they're inconvenient to acknowledge. She said the word interference and meant for it to land softly as a redirect. Instead, it landed like a door closing, and closed doors have weight. The intelligence I'm most grateful for isn't the kind that helped me do the math that November night, though that mattered. It's the intelligence that told me not to argue, not to plead, not to deliver a speech about everything I'd given. The wisest thing I did in this whole situation was stay quiet and then act. Norbert knew that. He said, don't talk about it. Just do it. 30 years of friendship, and that was the most useful thing he ever said to me. The hardest part wasn't stopping the transfers. The hardest part was sitting with the fact that I'd waited too long. That for years I'd seen the signs. The eye-rolling, the group chats I wasn't included in, the mild impatience on her face when I spoke, and I'd explain them away because it was easier than naming them. That's not weakness, exactly. It's the particular blindness that comes from loving someone. But it is something to reckon with. What I know now, at 64 after all of it, the most honest form of love I can offer is presence without agenda. I show up. I bring what I have. I don't attach conditions to it, but I also don't pretend the conditions don't exist when they've been stated out loud, in my own kitchen, in front of a guest I hadn't invited. That's not bitterness. That's just being awake. The wooden train set is still at their house. The 5-year-old sleeps with one of the cars sometimes, according to my son. I made that with my hands, in the garage, over 3 months. No one told me to. No one asked me to. That's the version of me I'm trying to keep.